Simon Crawley was the kind of man everyone trusted, a married pastor who preached about salvation, love, and faith. But when a young church volunteer named Emma Drayton vanished without a trace, the town discovered that behind his holy smile hid a monster capable of burying his sins in a shallow grave. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. In the peaceful countryside of Devon, England, Pastor Simon Crawley was a man everyone trusted. He lived in a small stone cottage with his wife, Margaret, just a short walk from the old church where he preached every Sunday. The church bell rang across the green hills, and families came from neighboring villages just to hear Simon speak. His sermons were calm and inspiring, filled with stories about forgiveness, honesty, and faith. The townspeople often said that Pastor Crawley had a gift, a voice that made people believe everything would be all right. He had baptized children, married couples, and comforted grieving families. To everyone who knew him, Simon was the kind of man who could never do wrong. Margaret, his wife of 15 years, shared that same image of perfection. She was quiet but kind, always organizing charity events and helping the poor. The couple rarely argued in public, and when they walked together through the village, people often whispered that they were the picture of true love. Their lives seemed simple and pure. The townsfolk saw their relationship as something sacred, almost untouchable. But what they didn't know was that beneath Simon's polished sermons and gentle smile, something much darker was hiding, something that had been growing quietly inside him for years. Simon loved the power that came with being admired. Every Sunday, as people gathered to listen, he felt an invisible weight of importance pressing on his shoulders. Their trust, their faith, their confessions, all of it gave him a feeling of control he couldn't explain. It made him feel needed, even worshipped. But behind the pulpit, when the lights dimmed and the crowd went home, he often stared at his reflection in the church window, seeing not a man of God, but a man trapped in his own lies. He had secrets, small ones at first, about the money he kept hidden from church donations, about the late-night drives to visit the sick, that were really excuses to escape the dullness of home. Margaret noticed the distance growing between them, but she convinced herself it was just stress from his work. At home, their conversations had become short and mechanical. Margaret tried to bring warmth back into their marriage, preparing his favorite meals, leaving notes on his desk, praying with him before bed. But Simon's heart had already drifted elsewhere, not yet to another woman, but to a hunger for excitement and attention. The devotion he once gave to God had turned inward. The sermons that once came from faith now came from habit. He still smiled and held hands with churchgoers, still spoke with compassion, but there was no sincerity behind it anymore. The people of Devon had no reason to doubt him. They saw what he wanted them to see: a devoted husband, a spiritual leader, a man of wisdom and virtue. He had built his reputation so carefully that even those closest to him could not imagine him doing harm. Yet within the quiet corners of his soul, Simon was beginning to sense that something inside him was slipping beyond his control. The perfect image he had created was cracking, and soon, beneath that calm and holy surface, something terrible would begin to take shape, something that would destroy not only his reputation but every life connected to him. Emma Drayton arrived in Devon on a cool spring morning, hoping to leave her old life behind. She was 28, quiet and thoughtful, with a past that had worn her down. After losing her job in London and ending a painful relationship, she needed peace, a place where no one knew her name or her story. When she passed by the small church in the center of the village, she felt something comforting about it. The old stone walls, the blooming roses near the gate, and the soft sound of the choir inside made her pause. It was there she met Pastor Simon Crawley for the first time. He greeted her with the same warmth he showed everyone, and within minutes he offered her a role as a volunteer to help with church events and community outreach. To Emma, it felt like a sign that life was giving her a second chance. At first, Emma's days in Devon were peaceful. She helped organize Sunday gatherings, sorted donation boxes, and read scripture to the elderly members who couldn't attend service. She was grateful for the kindness Simon showed her. He listened to her stories without judgment and seemed to understand her loneliness. He told her that she had a kind heart and a strong spirit, and for the first time in years she felt seen. Margaret Crowley, Simon's wife, also welcomed her politely, though her eyes carried a trace of something Emma couldn't quite name, something cold, almost suspicious. Simon began giving Emma more responsibilities. He asked her to handle church records, help decorate for services, and manage social media for outreach. Slowly, she became part of the inner circle of the church. Parishioners noticed how often Simon and Emma worked together, their heads bent over papers in his office long after everyone had gone home. Some smiled knowingly, thinking the pastor was mentoring the new volunteer. Others began to whisper. In small towns, whispers spread faster than truth, but Simon seemed unaffected. He continued to praise Emma during services, and often used her as an example of faith renewed through struggle. What no one saw was the emotional web he was weaving. Simon knew how to make people trust him. It was the same skill that kept his congregation loyal. He told Emma she was special, that she had been sent to help him carry his burden. His words were careful and calculated. Over time, his mentorship grew into something deeper, an emotional dependence that blurred the line between guidance and obsession. Emma, still fragile from her past, clung to his attention. She believed his kindness was genuine, unaware that his admiration had already turned into something dangerous. Margaret noticed the shift before anyone else. She watched her husband grow distant and distracted. His sermons became shorter, his prayers less sincere. He began staying out late, saying he was counseling troubled members. When she asked him about it, he reassured her gently, almost rehearsed, that he was only doing the Lord's work. Yet deep down she knew something had changed. The man she once loved, the man the entire village respected, was slowly slipping into darkness, and the new volunteer he had promised to protect would soon become the reason everything fell apart. The connection between Pastor Simon Crowley and Emma Drayton deepened quietly, hidden beneath the mask of mentorship and faith. What began as gentle encouragement and late-night talks about hope soon turned into something more personal, more secretive. Simon convinced himself that his feelings were pure, that what he felt for Emma was a kind of divine connection. But in truth, it was nothing holy. It was temptation, slowly poisoning his conscience. He began to crave her presence, the way she looked at him with admiration, the way she seemed to trust every word he said. For a man who lived on praise and control, that trust became his addiction. Emma, unaware of his growing obsession, started to believe that Simon genuinely cared for her beyond the church walls. He told her she had brought light into his life, that she gave him hope in a world full of sin and pain. She didn't see these words as dangerous. They sounded comforting to someone still healing from heartbreak and loneliness. When Simon began visiting her small rented flat to check on her well-being, she didn't refuse. She believed he was just being kind, perhaps even fatherly. But soon, kindness turned into secrecy. He began calling late at night, visiting her outside the church, and finding excuses to spend time alone with her. It wasn't long before the walls of the church became witnesses to something forbidden. They would sit in the empty pews after service, their voices hushed as if sharing confessions only meant for God. Simon promised Emma that his marriage to Margaret was over in spirit, that he was only staying with his wife for the sake of appearances. He told her that God wanted him to be honest with his heart, that she was the person he was meant to be with. The lies rolled off his tongue like scripture, and Emma, naive and hopeful, believed every word. But the closer they became, the more paranoid Simon grew. He feared that people in the church were watching him, that someone might have seen him with Emma outside the village. The gossip that started as murmurs began to sound louder in his mind. Margaret's eyes seemed to follow him with quiet suspicion. He started avoiding her, spending more nights at the church under the excuse of overnight prayer sessions. Margaret prayed too, but her prayers were no longer for the congregation. They were for her husband's soul, which she sensed was being devoured by something she couldn't stop. One evening, when Emma confronted Simon about his promises, his mask slipped for the first time. She had discovered that he had never told Margaret about her, and that he was still leading couples counseling sessions as though his own marriage was unshakable. Emma threatened to tell the truth if he didn't come clean. That moment marked the beginning of her end. Simon realized his perfect image, the one he had built over a decade, could crumble in an instant. In his mind, she had become not a woman he loved, but a danger he had to silence. The man who preached about forgiveness began planning a sin he would never be forgiven for. The rain began early that Friday evening, steady and cold, soaking the narrow lanes of Devon. Emma Drayton was seen leaving the church around 7 o'clock after what she told a friend was a serious conversation with Pastor Simon Crowley. She looked pale and nervous, clutching her handbag tightly as she walked toward her small silver car. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, her car was discovered parked near a wooded area 2 miles outside the village, doors locked and keys missing. Inside were her phone, her purse, and a notebook filled with church notes and scripture quotes. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints nearby. Just the echo of rainfall and the empty silence of the forest. The disappearance of Emma shook the entire community. She was known to everyone as kind, helpful, and deeply religious. The police launched an immediate search, combing through the dense woods and nearby rivers. Volunteers from the church joined, carrying flashlights and calling her name. Pastor Crowley led the group with his usual calm authority, his voice steady even as others grew frantic. He stood before the congregation on Sunday morning, his tone heavy with emotion, asking everyone to pray for Emma's safety. His words were moving, his tears convincing. People described his sermon as one of his most heartfelt ever. He spoke of faith being tested, of trusting God when everything seems lost. No one doubted his sincerity, not even the officers sitting quietly at the back of the church, watching him closely. Margaret Crowley sat alone during that service, her face blank, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had noticed her husband's behavior over the past few days. The restless pacing, the late nights, the way he flinched whenever someone mentioned Emma's name. Something about his grief didn't feel real. That night, she confronted him softly, asking if there was anything he wanted to tell her. He hugged her, whispered that he was simply heartbroken, and promised that he would never keep secrets from her. But Margaret knew he already had. As the police investigation deepened, they began to piece together Emma's final hours. CCTV footage from a nearby petrol station showed her car following a black sedan that matched the make and model of Simon's vehicle. Witnesses claimed they saw 2 people arguing near the forest road later that evening, one of them wearing dark clothes similar to what Simon often wore. Still, without solid evidence, suspicion alone wasn't enough to accuse him. He continued to attend every search operation, offering spiritual comfort to Emma's friends and even visiting her parents to pray with them. To the outside world, he was a man devastated by the loss of a member of his flock. But inside, Simon's calm exterior was beginning to crack. The weight of his actions pressed harder each day. He told himself it had been an accident, that things had gotten out of control, but the guilt didn't fade. He couldn't sleep. The rain that week seemed endless, and each drop against the window reminded him of the night he stood in the mud, staring at the shallow earth he had covered with shaking hands. He told no one, but deep inside he knew the truth couldn't stay buried forever, because secrets in small towns have a way of rising back to the surface, no matter how deep they are hidden. 3 weeks after Emma Drayton's disappearance, the quiet countryside of Devon awoke to a grim discovery. A local farmer named Harold West had gone out early one morning to check his sheep near the edge of a thick wooded area. As he crossed a muddy path, something unusual caught his eye. A patch of disturbed soil, oddly shaped, as though recently dug and covered in haste. At first, he thought it was the work of an animal, but when he leaned closer, he saw the faint outline of a human hand emerging from the dirt. Panic surged through him. Within the hour, police officers flooded the scene and the air was thick with dread. The grave was shallow, barely enough to conceal the body. When investigators carefully unearthed it, they found what everyone feared: the lifeless remains of Emma Drayton, still wearing the same clothes she had last been seen in. The news spread across Devon like wildfire. The same people who had prayed for Emma's safe return now wept openly in disbelief. Her gentle smile, her kindness, her hopeful nature, all were gone, taken brutally. The autopsy revealed that Emma had been struck on the head with a blunt object and then suffocated. The medical examiner estimated the time of death to be the same night she vanished. For the police, it was no longer a missing person case, it was murder. Pastor Simon Crowley was questioned immediately. His name had come up several times during interviews with church members. Some said Emma trusted him deeply, others whispered about how close they had become. Simon appeared calm when the detectives arrived at his home. He invited them in politely, offered tea, and answered every question with a sorrowful tone. He insisted he hadn't seen Emma after their meeting that evening, claiming she left the church to visit a friend. His composure impressed the officers, but something about his story didn't sit right. A breakthrough came when investigators examined Simon's black sedan. Mud from the tires was collected and sent for analysis. The results confirmed that the soil matched the same rare composition found near Emma's shallow grave, a specific blend of clay and sand found only in that section of the forest. That alone wasn't enough to convict him, but then came a second piece of evidence. A delicate gold necklace tangled beneath the seat of his car. It was broken, one half missing, and Emma's parents later confirmed it had belonged to her, a gift she never took off. Simon tried to explain it away, saying Emma must have dropped it accidentally after one of their church meetings. But the detectives were no longer convinced. His calm facade began to slip during interrogation. Small inconsistencies appeared in his timeline, moments where his memory faltered, and details didn't add up. Margaret, watching from their living room doorway, saw the fear flicker in her husband's eyes for the first time. She knew then that the man who once stood in the pulpit preaching salvation had done something unforgivable. And though the evidence was mounting, the most damning truth of all was still waiting, one that only she could reveal. Margaret Crowley had lived in silence for weeks, trapped between fear and guilt. Her husband's arrest had not yet happened, but she knew it was only a matter of time. Every day she watched detectives arrive at their doorstep, watched Simon put on his calm voice and polite smile as if nothing was wrong. But when night came, that mask would fall away. He would sit in the dark, staring at the floor, his hands trembling, muttering fragments of prayers that sounded more like confessions. The man she had once trusted with her heart and her faith now frightened her more than anyone else in the world. She knew things she could no longer keep buried. On the night Emma disappeared, Margaret hadn't slept. The storm had been loud, and she remembered hearing the front door creak open around midnight. When she looked through the window, she saw Simon walking toward his car, wearing his old brown boots, and carrying something heavy wrapped in a tarp. She had called out softly, but he didn't answer. Hours later, when he returned, his clothes were damp and streaked with mud. He washed them in the sink before dawn and told her not to worry, saying he had gone to visit a sick parishioner who lived outside the village. At the time she wanted to believe him, but when she saw the news about Emma's disappearance the next day, her stomach twisted. The image of him in the rain, the mud, the tarp, it all came rushing back like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. Still, Margaret said nothing. Fear kept her silent. For years, she had built her life around Simon's reputation. They were the perfect couple, respected and admired. To accuse him would destroy everything, not just for him, but for her too. Yet as the investigation deepened, and she watched the detectives slowly uncover the truth, her guilt became unbearable. She could no longer pray without hearing Emma's name echoing in her mind. When police came again to question Simon, Margaret made a quiet decision. After they left, she went to their bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of his desk, the one he always kept locked. Inside was a small leather-bound journal. She had seen him write in it for years, calling it his spiritual reflections. But as she flipped through the pages, her hands shaking, she realized these weren't reflections, they were confessions. He had written about temptation, about losing control, about a woman who had become a danger to his calling. One entry read, The sin must be buried before it buries me. Margaret took the journal to the police the next morning. She told them everything she knew, the late-night drive, the boots, the lies. Her voice broke as she spoke, but the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. For the first time in weeks, she felt free of the weight she had been carrying. The evidence she handed over would seal her husband's fate, turning the quiet suspicion of the village into undeniable truth. The holy man of Devon, the pastor who had promised to protect, had become the very thing he preached against, and now, his judgment day was finally approaching.